So hello and welcome to another issue of Sassi Talks. I'm your host Savahna, and on today's programme we're going to be speaking with Dr. Rose McCabe from City University, and she also specialises in mental health research. We're going to be talking today about the power of communication and how we can be better communicators. Now, who doesn't want to be a better communicator? I think we all do. She's doing some amazing research which she's going to tell us about, and is finding interesting ways to analyse conversations and is able to reveal some very interesting things. So Dr. McCabe, thank you so much for being on the programme with us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Oh, I certainly am. So tell us, let's dive straight in. Why is communication so important to us?
Well, I guess we're incredibly social beings. We all thrive on communication. I mean, before we learn how to talk, we're communicating as babies, we're communicating non-verbally, and that's an essential kind of part of our social fabric. Everything that we do is through communication. I think all of our experiences around the lockdown have really kind of shown us how much we've missed that kind of interaction and communication with other people. And particularly what you get from face-to-face communication, obviously, is something special that we don't get that online. So I think we've all really understood how important it is to us and to how we kind of our mood, our well-being, just those little rituals that we have with other people. So if we're socially isolated and we're not communicating with other people, that shortens our lifespan, and that's after taking other health, problems into account. So even after kind of adjusting for all those other things like heart disease or diabetes or exercise, all of those things. So it's much more important than I think we realized it was. All of this new research is suggesting.
Right. So tell us about this research that you do, because it sounds absolutely fascinating. You're recording conversations and you're analysing them. I'm nervous now.
No, not at all. Don't be nervous. I think what we do, most of our work is in mental health settings. So we record conversations between people who are supporting people with mental health difficulties. So we record the conversations, and we use a method called conversation analysis, which breaks down. It's a micro analysis of communication. Okay. So we look at all the tiny things like pauses, hesitations, nonverbal communication, body posture, eye contact. I know I'm making you feel extra nervous now, but once you start it's one of those things that once you start thinking about it, it becomes impossible to communicate. But we know that those things are really important, like nonverbal communication, that people, make up their minds about, other people very quickly in a conversation. They get a sense of whether they have a rapport with this person. So we know that nonverbal communication is very important.
So what are kind of the key non-verbal and verbal ways of communication, I guess? So,
obviously there's quite a lot in what we say, but actually there's a lot of information in how we say it. So there's a lot about kind of how do we feel after a conversation with somebody? Do we feel better? Do we feel worse? Do we feel not really moved at all? So I think the emotional tone is really important, and that comes more through in the nonverbal aspects and tone of voice and eye contact and posture. So it's how it's delivered, as much as what we say. Human relationships are the thing really that help people recover in mental health. So there's a nice quote from Rudyard Kipling, which is words are the most powerful drug. And it really is kind of emphasizes the role of that communication and relationship with somebody else. So there is a very kind of healing power in relationships that we can exploit. And it doesn't need to be sometimes, a professional that does that. Those kind of relationships can come in other ways, in communities, for example. So there's quite a big move in mental health care not to necessarily send everybody into services, because actually they're not maybe the most helpful thing for some people. So there's a lot of move towards what I think called social prescribing, which you may have heard of, but it's really connecting people into kind of social and community activities, like, for example, gardening or walking or singing groups or art groups or mums groups or dads groups. So it's really about kind of social connection with other people.
That's interesting, isn't it? So you're in these environments now where you're interacting with other people and perhaps then not necessarily talking about the issues that you're experiencing, or is it that we're looking to develop relationships with people in those groups and then open up to them?
Yeah. So it's a really good point that you're making. I think it can be a mix of those things, depending on how open people are willing to be, or feel how comfortable they feel with, strangers. It's difficult sometimes, but sometimes, people meet other people in these settings who get it and who have been in a similar situation themselves. And so you have an immediate connection and a kind of a bond there. And that really helps people to know that they're not alone also in what they're going through. And also, I mean, one of the interesting things that comes up here is about men's mental health. So it's very traditionally quite difficult for men to open up about their mental health because it's, seen as it's very stigmatized among men and seen as weak. And we know there's a lot of men, for example, who end up, maybe trying to even take their own life or something, even though they've never sought help before. So they reach a crisis point, even though they've been struggling for a long time. So there's a real kind of emphasis on trying to support men to kind of open up a bit more. And some of these groups are more helpful because, recently I was talking to a man who runs kind of walking groups for men's mental health. And he was saying that one of the good things is just kind of doing something with other people, and you don't necessarily have to be that explicit or open up too much. You can do it as much as you want or as little as you want. You don't have to. Whereas if you're in a therapy session, it's all about often kind of talking about the thing, whereas people might not want to do that sometimes.
And how might you be able to identify the signs that somebody is experiencing issues? I mean, you've spoken significantly there about men and how there's a stigma around opening up. How could those closest to an individual who might be experiencing something be able to identify and help them better?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there are different signs for different kind of difficulties. Obviously, when somebody's becoming kind of if somebody's becoming depressed or, it's often noticeable in kind of things like they become maybe a bit more withdrawn, they become less talkative, they become maybe a little bit more irritable, they avoid, social contact. And that's kind of something that people can manage better actually over, text, for example, because you can say, oh, I'm fine, but actually you're not getting all the nonverbal cues that you would get from a face-to-face interaction. So checking in with somebody, making a phone call can be really important.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it can be so hard to identify somebody who is experiencing something. I mean, you see these great sort of juxtapositions of images online where you've got somebody who looks quite depressed and then you see them celebrating in a party and they're drinking and they look like they're having a great time. And that's actually the person who could potentially be experiencing depression.
Absolutely. I think that's such an important point. And while I said there are signs, I mean, it's not always the case. And often people have an idea of what they think like depressed looks like. But actually, many people say to us that, the day they felt most at their worst, really in a crisis is the day when they're out at a party, looking happy. And so, we can't make assumptions either. So it's about kind of being aware that, as you said, that it's not necessarily what it seems, and we need to be really aware of that.
So is there like a checklist of things that we can do to be better communicators ourselves? Is there like a top 10 list? The reason I'm saying this is because not everybody may know themselves that they're experiencing a mental health issue. They may have become used to or accustomed to being a certain way, especially during lockdown when everybody is so much more isolated. We've adapted to being by ourselves by and large. So how can we? What would be a potential checklist of what we could do to make sure, almost like a health checklist? Are we doing the right things, and how can we express ourselves better?
Well, I think if we had the answer to that, we'd have all our problems solved. I think really it's small things that we should be thinking about, and it's really kind of sitting down and taking time to kind of sometimes, when you get that kind of "I'm fine" response, "How are you?" "I'm fine." "How are you?" "I'm fine." It's actually going, probing a little bit more than that, and so not being, if you think that things maybe aren't quite right, but I think is to be able to follow that up and say, so, what's been happening and what's that been like for you?
When we shine the light on ourselves, how can we almost do an examination of our own mental health and express where we are?
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think sometimes when we're checking in on ourselves is quite hard to do sometimes. And sometimes, like, reflecting on how we've been, for example, in a particular day, if we feel like we're getting like stressed or overwhelmed or irritated, is to actually be able to notice that, and to be able to, so I think noticing is the first thing before you can kind of do something about it, whether that's, doing the kind of thing that makes you feel better. I think what we can see is that when you see two people kind of having good connection and a good kind of interaction, that really makes people feel better. And that, we can see that in really kind of what you might consider to be kind of really extreme situations, like people who are suicidal, for example, that they can come into, an accident and emergency hospital after having taken, a serious overdose. And if they have a therapeutic conversation with somebody, that gives them hope, that and that their life is actually worth living. So these are high stakes situations, and we can really visibly see the impact that a positive or a negative kind of interaction has on people. So yeah, that's kind of, for me, I find that incredibly exciting, because I think that we all know that kind of a conversation with somebody has the power to kind of make us feel better or worse. But when you're feeling down and you're struggling, that the power of that becomes even greater.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. McCabe, for being on Sassi Talks. It's a fantastic and fascinating conversation. It's some great research that you are doing. And I look forward to hearing more as we go forward and finding new and better ways in which we can understand those closest to us and understand ourselves better as well. I think the key takeaway here is to get out and socialise.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
And if this is the first time that you're watching Sassi Talks, be sure to like us and follow us on Instagram and YouTube. And we look forward to seeing you again on the next one.